Well, hello and welcome to the Alpha Anywhere demo and Q&A webcast, our first one for the year 2020. Thanks for joining us today. Today, like we do on all of our Alpha Anywhere demo and Q&A webcasts, we are going to do a quick demonstration at the beginning. I believe today we're going to be talking about expanding menus a bit, but then we're here to answer your questions, and you can ask those questions by typing them into the questions box of the GoToWebinar control panel. All right, so let's get started. I'm pleased to present Dion McCormick, no relation, our lead solutions engineer, and I'm Dave McCormick, VP of Products and Services here at Alpha Software. Also joining us today, Sarah Mitchell, who's in charge of documentation, and Scott Allen, who's in charge of design here at Alpha for visual design. So let's get started. Hello, Dion, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Excellent. I'm going to go ahead and make you the presenter so we can see your screen.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
There
Welcome
you
to
are.
2020.
Fantastic.
Excellent. Well, hey, thank you everybody for joining us for our, again, as Dave mentioned, our first webinar of the new year. We are super excited about this year. There's so many cool things that are planned. A lot of stuff happened at the end of the last year in terms of capabilities, features, etc., which we're going to be covering over the next few weeks. A lot of really neat new little features that really just make your user interface just rock and make your life simpler. And that's going to be one of our topics today in terms of how to better leverage one of the existing components that have been in there for some time now. But there are so many cool things planned for both Alpha Anywhere and Transform. And as we've talked about before, Transform Tuesdays are on Tuesdays. I guess pretty literal naming of the situation, but make sure if you're interested, Transform is also growing in leaps and bounds in terms of capabilities. A lot of neat stuff coming on, and I can't wait for you to see more and more of what's happening there. So make sure you send an email to guides@alphasoftware.com. They'll get you signed up for those. And again, we're here for your questions. So I'm going to do this presentation. And if there's questions on this presentation, please go to your GoToWebinar control panel and put your questions into the Q&A section there. And Dave and Sarah will be keeping an eye on it, and we'll go through as many of those possible, both on the topic today, but also any other topics. And we always love to have you send in topics ahead of time. So if you do want to cover something or have a question, go ahead and send it to guides@alphasoftware.com. And we will try to accomplish and accommodate any of those kind of requests as much as possible. So it's, again, going to be a very busy year, but I want to kind of start out with two things real quick. One is I'm going to do a demo, and it's going to focus on what's called the expanding menu. And we've talked about that before. And actually, at the end of last year, we also covered the fact that in the control bar is now an expanding menu capability, very similar to what you're going to see today. So we're really trying to make it easy for you to implement these kind of menus, etc., within the system. What I want to cover today is that there are a couple ways to set up those menus, and I want to cover the different methods, and more importantly, how you can make it data-driven so your life will be really simple in terms of creating on-the-fly menus that adjust themselves based on what's going on in your application. So that's what we're going to focus on today. But I also wanted to cover something pretty cool. And I'm going to go back over to here, and we'll go ahead. Let me go back here. And I just want to pause this for a second. And I'll grab our. Okay. And we are back online there. Cool. Okay. One thing I wanted to highlight, which we will be covering very soon, if not next week, probably a week after, but there's been some new pre-releases, and I just wanted to do, but there was a really cool new feature that was added. A lot of new bug fixes and cleanup and other things like that. But the number one feature really is this real-time messaging. There's a third-party service. A little background. Often in your applications, you have a requirement in terms of being able to communicate to the client on an ongoing basis. So for instance, let's say someone has a dashboard, and what you want to do is periodically you want to update that dashboard, but you don't want to kill your server where every minute you're basically having that dashboard refresh and putting all the demand. So Alpha has had a capability for some time called WebSockets that allow you to register a client, i.e. say a dashboard running in a browser. And then if something changes, the server can actually send a message to the client and have it do a refresh or do any other kind of activity there. And we've used what's called WebSockets, and it works really well. But we found as we moved on to IIS and more importantly onto Alpha Cloud, we're finding there's certain limitations, certain things around the whole WebSocket architecture that have a certain set of limitations. And we wanted to make sure you weren't faced with those. So we have now gone out and found there is a service called Pusher.com. And this is a third-party service. It is basically the ability to do that push notification capability, or really that WebSocket type activity. It's much more robust in terms of you can set up channels and everything else. So it's super powerful. And what the development team has done is gone ahead and pre-incorporated the way to integrate with that service. So you still need the service, but what it allows you to do is build these kind of capabilities. And there's some great robust examples here. And it really is going to open up a lot of really neat things, because as your applications become more and more social, it's very important that you have these more sort of dynamic ways to communicate between the server and the client, and also make sure you don't impact the server performance. One thing that's important about this is that their pricing is very good. So unless you're doing super high levels of volumes, so basically to a large degree, it's a free service. And again, it has a very rich capabilities. So, that allow you to do in-app capabilities within it. So I just wanted to plant the seeds. We're going to come back and do detailed presentations on this, but we're very excited about it because it opens up not only ways to handle existing capabilities, but it may open up whole new capabilities that you may find interesting in the future. So we're going to come back and do that, but that's in the latest pre-release, excuse me. Another thing too is we have been working on the upload files to S3. If you attended one of our webinars recently, you'll notice that we now have a drag and drop feature, which allow you to drag and drop files onto your browser, and then they get uploaded to S3 or the Alpha server. And what's really cool about this is now we've enhanced that with some capabilities to be able to process those files after upload. So we'll cover a few of those other things here. But if you're eager, go ahead. The pre-release is available. I will go ahead and put the address in the chat box. As we always tell you, this is pre-release. And what's very important is to make sure that if you do install it, realize it's not meant for production. You can install it on the same machine, but just got to be a little careful on it. And again, this will allow you to test it out, work with it, make sure it does everything you need. And then down the road, when it becomes production, you will have all these capabilities and you'll be ahead of the curve. So don't wait for me. If you're interested, go ahead. There's some example videos and components that are available to check out there. Now, what I want to focus on today is something we've covered a little bit more, which is the expanding menu concept. So I'm going to jump over into my Alpha environment here, and let me go ahead and open up and show you a demonstration. So actually, you know what, before I show this demonstration, the first thing I want to do is I'm going to create a new UX component, and I just want to add an expanding menu to it to kind of show the basics here. So the expanding menu is a data control, and I'll explain why it's a data control in a few more minutes here. But you'll see we have a capability here called expanding menu. And this will set up right here on this. Sorry, I had to adjust my headphones. Let me go ahead and here, expanding menu. Okay. So with the expanding menu, I'm going to go ahead and open it up, and there's a full genie that allows you to manage this menu, set the colors, everything you need to do it. And there are two primary ways you can define the content of the expanding menu. One is through the built-in genie, and then the other is through what's called JSON, where you can actually use JSON to define the menu. And that's kind of one of the trends you're going to see. Everything's driven by JSON. So the more you know JSON, the better. And the cool thing about JSON is that there are many cool techniques in order to generate JSON. So I'm going to use the genie first. I'm going to open it up. And if you've done anything with like these expanding menus, you'll know this, but I'll say, item 1, item 2, sub item 2.1. So you can kind of just type it in, and basically it creates a hierarchical structure for your menu. And then you can go and start putting in icons and what the click events, etc., are within it. And in fact, the reality is this is just an editor that's generating a JSON representation of that menu item. And I wanted to kind of show you this because behind the scenes, everything is being driven by the JSON representation. So you'll see I have a list of items. We have our first one here, which is item 1. Then we have a second one, which has the second one here is item 2, but it has a children, which is that sub item 2.1. So, the nice thing is if you want to kind of learn this, you can just kind of build it using the Genie and be able to set it up from there. So now I've built my expanding menu and I can use it. And often, to a large degree, sometimes menus are static, meaning those are these are the menu items. And for your application, they're not going to change over time. They're maybe your master menu, and you might have, you can do a few things kind of interesting within the menu is that you can, for instance, link menu items to security groups. So you can say, hey, like if it's an administrator, then they can see this item. If they're not, they can't see that. And what will happen is when Alpha runs, it looks at the current user's role or group, and it allows them to do that. So there's also server show hide expressions where you can make little expressions saying like if session.debug is equal to true, then go ahead and show this item. If not, so there's a certain amount of stuff you can do within the key structure of the Genie. But then there's points where you go, you know what, that's great, but I need to be able to change this menu on the fly. And that's really the focus of our conversation today. But I want to kind of give you a quick background, kind of bring you back up to speed on the expanding menu and show you how you can build it very easily using the Genie. And then you still have a lot of flexibility in terms of how to show and hide items within the menu. You'll notice there isn't really to add items or anything on the fly. That's where you're going to have to use scripting from there. So again, very simple, very easy to use. But now let's move our target over to the situation where, let's say you have a menu, and that menu maybe is going to be database driven, where you want to use that menu almost as a navigation tool to show a hierarchical list of items from your database. That's one of the cool things about the expanding menu is that it is so powerful. Not only can you use it for static menus, but you can use it for, and why it's in data controls, data to be able to display the menu. Now, I'd like to take credit for figuring all this out, but I'm not going to do that. Rather, I'm going to go here, and let me go ahead and grab this here. Outstanding documentation is available, provided by our development team, and more importantly, Sarah, who has joined us here to talk about the expanding menu and the fact that on this we have items that talk about how you can define the menu, stuff we've covered so far, but importantly, we have the ability to do, for instance, dynamically populate an expanding menu using AJAX callbacks. So you can see in here, there's some documentation on how to do that. There's a number of different functions that allow you to provide more flexibility. There's some helper functions to make your life easier. And most importantly, there's some videos and a download component here. So I've already gone ahead and taken the time to download this component here. And you'll see basically in this component, we have an expanding menu. And if I go into that expanding menu, it initially uses a Genie and there's nothing to it because we're going to show you how you can dynamically populate it. But you can set the colors, you can set everything else within this menu and you're good to go. And you'll notice we have two buttons here that when you click on them, those buttons actually modify the contents of that menu. So let me go ahead and show you this in operation. And then we're going to kind of dive in and go behind the scenes to talk about how or what is going on and how this is actually working. So we have our UX control. You'll see I have two buttons here, one called populate using an AJAX callback, the other is with a SQL query. They're both actually using Xbasic callbacks, meaning calling back to the server, getting and generating the menu information, and then updating the menu accordingly. So let's go ahead and do this one first. So you'll see when I click that, the expanding menu, which had 0 content, now has content. And this content can be sophisticated. It can be multi-level. It can have different icons, different colors. You can see that it's got built into this menu different activities. So if I click on A1, triggers JavaScript, etc. So anything you can do through the menu genie when you build it, you can replicate using it programmatically. So the idea, which is really neat about this, is that you could, of course, set up the genie and then set up who gets to see what, but you may want to be able to say, you know, in this particular situation, I want to just create a custom menu right there, right when they open it, and then be able to at any time update that menu with the information. Now, beyond that, even more powerful is some capabilities that allow you to drive this menu content from the database. So you'll notice I have another button here. It's called Populate Expanding Menu with a SQL Query. So let's go ahead and click that. And it did a query to the database, and check it out. It actually created an expanding menu based on data in my database. And if I click on one of these items, you'll see it's a country with a city code. And we're using the classic North Winds model to call in to get that information. So the neat thing is if I go into the database table and I modify a couple things, guess what? My menu, when refreshed, will show that information. And that's really powerful. That means literally you could create menus off of database tables, and that's useful for a couple different ways. One is you can create your own kind of menu management system where you have a set of tables and it just shows up and works here. Alternatively, you might have and use this as a navigation. So for instance, let's say I had an embedded report here. I could set this up so when I clicked on Salzburg and an individual, you'll notice that it fires off a event showing me information about that event individual. And it's really the account code here. That could be then updating a report or filtering a grid or doing any number of other kind of things. So the ability for you to build an expanding menu out of a database structure is very powerful and it can be used in many different ways. And the neat thing is once you've built it once, whenever you change the data in your underlying database, the next time they refresh this menu, they're going to see that latest information. Really, really cool. So I just want to spend a few minutes, realize the videos walk you through it and there's the components, so you don't have to like recreate this, but I wanted to kind of point out some of the cool things about it and how it kind of basically works, just to kind of get you a kickstart down the direction on which you want to go. So as we said before, we have an expanding menu. In that expanding menu, we set up the menu color, the text type, the other things like that. It's also got some defaulted classes for the different items. Notice you can change all the icons and the navigation kind of pieces there. You can apply your own styling. There's many different ways. In fact, if you go down here to usage tips, this tells you a little bit more about some things you can do within the system here. Now, the power of this is the following, is I've got two buttons here. So let's look at the first one that's the non-database one. So I have a button here. When I click on that button, it does an AJAX callback. And that AJAX callback calls a function called XB. And for people who are new, we're going to be into a little scripting here, but don't worry, it's copy, paste, modify, very straightforward kind of stuff. But the way this works is that when the person is using the system, they're in their web browser on their mobile device. And they're out there, you know, they're not actually on the server, they're on their local device. And what an AJAX callbacks does is it sends a message from that web browser or mobile device back to the server and says, hey, do me a favor, run this function for me. And then it waits and listens for and it's asynchronous, but it waits for some information to come back. And that allows you to then send information back. So what's going to happen is when the person clicks on this, it's going to go back to the server, build the menu content, and then send commands back to the client to update that menu. So what we can do is we can now go over here to Xbasic Functions. That is where that function lives. And you'll see it's right here that I'm clicking this little drop down here. We've got two functions, one called Xbsequel for when we're pulling it from the SQL, and the other one's called XB. And so let me go ahead and shrink my thing here. So you can see we have a function here called XB. Now, it's going to look a little confusing, but bear with me. So the first thing we're going to do is remember, and let me go back and remember this. Let's go to our expanding menu. And, oh, I'm sorry, not that one. Let's go to this one. And remember I told you that the actual menu is JSON. So this is this JSON here. So what you need to do is generate that JSON and submit that. So you'll notice in our example here, we're actually generating that JSON. And there's some escape characters and things like this, but you can see that we've generated that JSON. And this is the same as what I did in the Tree Genie, but I just have it programmatically. And this is the power, is that you can take this and create and generate this on your own via any kind of methodology. And I'll show you a couple tricks in a minute. And then what you do is, once you've generated that, you run a little command that says, convert it to this. So this is a built-in command that's going to take this JSON, and then this will allow you to convert it into data that the JSON or the expanding menu can use. And then it allows you to then go in and populate that expanding menu control. So basically this shows, and again, this is copy and paste. I know this may look a little confusing here, but the reality is you're not going to change any of this. Where you're going to focus on is how do you generate this text here. But the beauty of that is now you have the ability to generate this and look at server-side information, call other web APIs, do database lookups, you name it, you can do that from within this system here. And again, this will be all the same, as it'll take that menu information, turn it into a set of JSON that the expanding menu will like. And then basically this is just doing assigning this information, this data, this JSON data, and then doing a refresh to refresh from there. And then the last thing we're doing is taking all of this and sending it back to the client to be refreshed there from that standpoint. So again, when I click here, all it's really doing is generating or grabbing a set of JSON and then putting it in here. I mean, something as simple as could be, you could pre-generate these menus, store them in a database table, and in this function, go look it up in the database table, pull back all of this information from, say, a text field, and then populate that. So there's ways you can dynamically generate it, but there's other things where you can use the menu genie to kind of pre-create it and have it in your database to be able to reuse for different menu styles. Very powerful, very easy, and makes it a lot more flexible. Now, this was a situation where I generated the menu data for quote unquote manually or programmatically. But as we mentioned before, Alpha has a very strong, powerful capability to actually do a query against a database and generate that. And it uses a built-in function here called A5 SQL to JSON expanding menu. So basically it takes a SQL setup. This is very much like a lookup function that we have in here. So and you'll notice, wow, this looks a little familiar. This is exactly the same code. Basically, after you have that JSON, you use the exact same code here to take and then refresh the actual expanding menu. So the heart of it is just from here to here, which is how to it. So you'll notice in here that I'm going through this. The first thing I'm doing is setting up my connection string, and this is using the Northwind. I'm setting what table I'm looking at. I'm telling it which fields I want to bring back. So I want to bring back country, city, and contact. Now, this endpoint field is sort of the key one because that is what is the primary key or the value I want to sort of link to every item in my menu. And I'll go back and show that in a few moments here. And then you can set up a filter. So you can make this dynamically filtered. You could set up ordering for your menu. And then last but not least is that you have an endpoint function name, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, called select customer. So what we're doing here is saying, okay, the endpoint field is that sort of unique ID for each menu item. Now we can tell it, well, what function, and that's what this endpoint function, what JavaScript function should I call and pass it that customer information. And again, once you've set this up, this function right here literally builds all of this for you from the database. So it makes your life very, very easy and very to do it. So let's go back and look at how it's operating again. So I'm going to go back in and show you real quick. So when I click here, it's going to call a database. It's going to pull those three fields. It's going to combine those into a hierarchical structure, and it's going to link to each of the items. If I go in here, the endpoint here, you'll notice when I click on here, it's saying select ranch. So ranch is that endpoint ID, that key ID. And if I go to each one, you do it. Now the question you may ask me is, well, why is this little thing bumping up? Why do I have an alert here going on? Well, in our code, remember, we tell it that we have an input function name. So that means that when someone clicks on any of your menu items, it will always call a function called select customer and pass that customer ID. And where do we find that? We find that over here in JavaScript functions. So you'll see we have a very simple JavaScript function. Here's the name of that function, select customer. Notice this text, that is that endpoint ID. That's that value that's being passed. And now in this case, all it's doing is throwing up an alert saying select and then the value of that. But in here, I could do any number of things. I could call some other action JavaScript. I could set a hidden field. I could execute and refresh a report that was bound to a argument. Lots of different things you can do. It's sort of up to you to kind of do it from here. That's why this makes it so powerful, is that it's generic. It's like, we'll do the work of kind of building the menu, identifying what that key is, and then calling a function. And then in that function, you can do anything you want with that information. So it has a lot of fun there. So the expanding menu is very powerful because not only can you sort of manually create that JSON, either pull it from a database where you've pre-created it, or on the fly you can create it, or secondarily, you can pull it from a SQL database structure and thus load a menu right from a database table, and it does all the work for you, which is really nice and very, very powerful there. So that's the expanding menu. Again, I get started just using the menu data genie, kind of get used to it. And as you do that more, you can kind of understand what the JSON is going to be generated from those items from there. And then once you get more comfortable there, then you can dive into making it more dynamic in terms of database driven. Now, the reason I'm showing you this is I want to do this both as a follow-on to the expanding menu, but also in the control bar, we now have the expanding menu capability in the control bar. So if you have a control bar in your application, now you can create a dynamic menu that can be either fixed at the top. Well, it's not dynamic, but fixed at the beginning, but then on the fly, you can update that by calling an Xbasic function, refreshing it, and then updating it so that, say, for instance, you want to have a drop down that has a list of cities or something like that in the control bar that you can select from. So it really expands your ability, no pun intended, the ability to use the expanding menu, because you're not just locked into, okay, I've got to kind of pre-remember everything. I've got to set up my genie. I've got to set up who gets sees what. It's kind of a fixed entity. The reality is you can make it where it's completely data or database driven within the system there. So I'm going to hold here. I'm going to go ahead and open it up for questions, Dave and Sarah, or comments, and we'd love to gather those. But man, I have a lot of fun playing with it because it's so powerful.
Excellent. Yes, so we do have some questions. Let's start with one that came about when you were talking about the pre-release notes. We'll start at the very beginning.
Oh, sure.
And the question was just about the S3 features. And I wanted to know, could this also work with Wasabi, the alternative to S3?
I've been seeing more and more about that. Well,
my understanding is that Wasabi is a direct plugin direct replacement, much the same way that MariaDB and MySQL are direct replacements, or at least that's what they said on their site. So I'd have to say I don't know unless you know.
I have not tried it. My guess is that it's Wasabi Cloud Storage, and it's just and to be honest, S3 is so cheap. I'm not sure how you would undercut their pricing, but
they do actually.
I think amazing. For really large, I think it's one of those things where S3, when you hit certain points, it starts getting there. Right. And maybe there's other hidden fees that I'm not worried or I haven't really dealt with, but my guess is that it wouldn't work out of the gate just because it's kind of tied to the S3. We're tying to the S3 API structure to the uploads and downloads from that standpoint. Now, very important, Alpha, when we build what are called storage connection strings. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, right now we support, and I'm opening up the builder, so bear with. We support Azure S3 disk, which is hard disk, and
so
SharePoint.
When you choose S3, what does it ask you for?
Oh, it's asking me for an access key and a secret key.
And the region, right? So it already knows what the URLs are supposed to be, so that's tied in there.
And if I go to Azure, same kind of thing. It's asking for the account, the access key, and things like that.
I'll tell you what, that doesn't look like that would be terribly difficult to add if the person had a good use case for it.
Let me show you. If you really want Wasabi, pal, and it's important, go to help send an enhancement request.
There we go.
And I don't have the current version. I know this is my old one here, because we may have already enhanced it by the time you get this. Go ahead and say yes. And what this does is that you can either go ahead and do it here, or you can use your browser based, and basically you can copy the message and it goes to the right email address, etc. But send it in. We want your enhancement requests. The team takes them very serious because you're our customers. You know what you want to do. So if having Wasabi as a new and my guess is you're right. If it's S3 compliant, it's probably a pretty straightforward kind of scenario. But there are different endpoints for Wasabi and stuff than S3. And so where do we call to call Wasabi? So if you're interested, go ahead and do that. Send in an enhancement request. In fact, my enhancement request is to change the send enhancement request to there. Ready? Let's go ahead and would that be a bug report or a bug report or I'm gonna put it as an enhancement request because that seems nicer than a bug report. Bug is so damning. It's like you screwed up. Change this. This is like, hey, I just saw this. Not you'd like to maybe use English or things like that. Anyway, so please, we want to hear your enhancement requests. It helps us drive the tool, what we want to do. Trust me, I've sent in 2 this week because there are things I like, and often sometimes they're little small things they can crank out very quickly, and it just and you don't know how many other people are going to use that capability. What is nice is often in enhancement requests, what I would suggest is give a little background. What I try to do is include a use case for my enhancement request. And the reason why is I want to give the development team, well, why do I want it to do this? Or what do I want to do it from here? What is the value of that? And how does that allow me to do something or satisfy an end client's requirements? So again, the more detail, obviously keep it succinct, but if you can give use case background, that gives them the context to understand, well, why do you want this enhancement? Why can't what is there already? And sometimes you might find that they'll send back and say, hey, there's already a feature that handles it. And especially if you give them the use case, it helps them guide that kind of conversation with you.
Yeah, good point.
Wasabi.
Thanks, Dion. Wasabi. What's up?
Wasabi.
All right,
like
so
wasabi.
on to the expanding menu questions. So this question, I kind of like this one, is they wanted to know, instead of having, for example, you gave an example which displayed cities, would it be possible to do like a group of cities A to M and cities N to Z, for example? And how would you go about doing that if you could?
That's a really good question. So let's go ahead and the answer is yes. You'll have to do a little bit of research, but let's go into this here and go into our server side. Let's go, I'm sorry, Xbasic Functions. So you can see the way we're doing it is we're telling it, this is the hierarchy of the menu. So you'll notice we have hierarchy of country, city, contact name. And let's go ahead and see here. Let me go, let's have fun. We're going to do that with there. So you'll see our hierarchy is country, city, person kind of thing right here. So if I wanted to, I could say, instead of contact name, or let's try this. Let's just break it. Let's go city, comma, country. I wonder if that's going to work. We'll see. But you're basically dictating the hierarchy of the menu by determining the order of those that goes there. Yep, there's city, country, and people. So what you could do is in your database structure, you could have group, which would be like A to M. And then that would be your first column. And then your second column would then be the country. And you would then in your table, A to M would only have, records that are from A to M from the country name and from there. And then all you have to do is go in and change this here to say, group, comma, country, comma, city, and off to the races. So you may have to do some prep work in your database. Now, and so from that standpoint here, because this is building that query here. So you may, and one way you can do is, by the way, this is a table, but that table could be a view. So you don't actually have to create a table. You could create a view in your database and then do the query against that view. And that view may have grouped it by A to M. So you can use your database to do all that kind of hardcore grouping and other work from there, actually enhancing the data with other information. And then this is kind of just, I'll use that view and go from there.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Next question. When selecting an option on the expanding menu, how can you automatically close the other branches? Is there an option for that?
I think there is. And I think that's part of that. Let's see. So let's go in here. Um, okay, when you click on a leaf node, you might want to collapse the menu. Yeah, so this tells about the leaf here. But that's a little different here. Um, let's see what else. Let's see. There is also, let's go to the, nope, to the menu here. Let's see. So this sounds like it. So I'd watch this video here. But
Yeah,
it sounds like when you select an action on a leaf node, meaning underneath it, you may want to collapse the menu so that some or all of the expanded nodes are collapsed. Yeah, maybe that is it.
that
So
sounds like it.
it sounds like it. And if it's not exactly it, guess what?
Guides.
Or even better,
Oh,
send an enhancement request to add a feature or a little function that will say collapse everything except me or something like that. You know,
mhm.
those little things are save a lot of coding and JavaScript and things like that. It's just we may not have anticipated that requirement from that standpoint. Now within the menu itself, let's see. Yeah, there's no real let's see. Oops, let me go to the other one here. Um, let's see. On click, on the click event, you can trigger that activity. But again, I just don't know off the top of my head how you would say, okay, expand everything else except maybe the item I'm on or something like that. I can see what you're saying is that, for instance, if I go back to the database one, let's try this out. It's kind of by inherent. Uh, okay, like for instance, what I may want to do is like so I start here and I go, oh, I want to go to Brazil. When I click Brazil, I might want Austria to hide because
Mhm.
otherwise I start getting into this like thing that's so long because it keeps all these open. So I'm guessing that's like what people would like is that if I click on Germany, then everything else collapses except for Germany so that my menu stays in context or on the screen as much as humanly possible. So we'll
Yep.
have to check in and see what we can find out about that.
Very good. Thanks. Um, you had talked about, I think, security access as it applied to the menus. Is that correct, or was
That
that
is correct. Yes.
okay?
So if I go into and I build my menu using the menu data genie,
Uh-huh.
you'll notice that we have something over here called security groups.
I
So
see.
if security groups has been activated, when I click on this, it will show me a list of groups that are in my project.
Hmm.
And based on those groups, I can say, if I enable like one or two of those groups, then it's going to be hidden except for the groups that I've selected. So it doesn't have to be turned on, but this way you can say, only administrators can see this item. And that works both on sub items, but also on paired items. So if I say the security group for item 2 is administrators only, if I'm not an administrator, I don't see item 2 or anything underneath it from there. And I can do that within the security through group setting in the tree data genie. And you can, when you build the menu programmatically, it does allow you to set security groups in the JSON because it's all just a setting inside the JSON and it allows you to set it. So even if you build it on the fly, you could embed in there security information to say the menu can only be seen by certain groups that are in your system.
Okay, great.
Now,
And that's
one
embedded
other
in the
little
G.
note,
Hmm.
you can also do the show hide JavaScript, and this will also allow you to do more kind of like don't show this menu item if someone has selected something on the screen or
Hmm.
if a certain value is in a field. So and you could also do that on the server side. You could say, don't show this menu if session dot item 2 is equal to true, then show it if session dot item 2 is equal to false. So you can do it both on the server and the client side. Nice thing on the client side is that if you modify something on the client, it will immediately change that menu to say show and hide it on the fly.
Right. With the, but from a security point of view, it's probably safer on our server side since it would never
But
appear in the client if you weren't.
that's correct. And they couldn't like click and look at the source and see some stuff in the
Yep.
client side because it has to be there to be able to show an eye.
Exactly. Yeah,
Good
gotcha.
point.
Someone asked if there's an update on the calendar control for the list control, and I don't yet have an update, but I will ask as soon as I get out of this meeting. I know it's one of our #1 priorities, so
Yes.
it'll come out soon.
And it's not this one right here, not calendar. We've had that for some time. But in
Right.
the list control, there's an option to
Along
set
with
it
map
as
and
like Kanban
Kanban. Yeah.
or Kanban. Is it Kanban or Kanban? I think it's Kanban.
Kanban. I don't know.
I don't know.
Another question. Oh, so in one of the coding examples you had just shown, you had to escape out some of the characters for the JSON string that you created. And
Yeah.
as someone pointed out, when you're using the curl genie in Alpha Anywhere, it's nice enough to do that escaping for you. Is
Yes,
there
it
any
is.
Xbasic trick or something that can escape your stuff? Like,
Not that I know of. What's interesting, yeah, not that I've known of.
okay.
The reason why is that when this gets parsed, if it sees this comma, it can get confused. So that's why it does the escaping because,
Hmm.
because we want
When it
that
sees the single
actually.
quote, you mean? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So can you
Um,
just for sort of
sure.
newer people, can you explain how you escape things in Xbasic if you had to do that manually?
Oh, yes. So Xbasic, you'll have certain commands and you'll want to do it. So let me go ahead and let me think. SQL query is equal to um, select star from customers where name is equal to, and I'm gonna. This is not.
You're right, exactly.
Yeah,
We're gonna break it
this
on
is
purpose.
not real, but
Yeah.
so I've got a problem here. You'll notice that in my in here, we actually have a uh, a double, a quote
Double
here.
a quote. Yep.
So it's misinterpreting that. So what I can do is the quick and dirty way is to put in two, and if you put two double quotes, it escapes that value.
Hmm.
So that's a quick and dirty way for quotes. If you need to have a quote in a string, you just double it. And what it does is when it sees this, it says, oh, that's not my outside quote. That's just escaping a character that's in my string. Now, the other thing I do often, just because I like to simplify my life, is I go here and I do this. And then what I do is I copy this here and put it here, get rid of my double quotes. And you'll notice that basically it's smart enough to say, just everything in here is a string. It's,
Hmm.
so this is a quick way to not even have to worry about escaping my quote characters by putting it within this, because it's going to treat everything between here and here as text. And it's not going to try and treat it as part of the interpreter of the Xbasic itself.
Hmm.
So from those stands here. Now, another thing I do, which is kind of a trick, but I'll go SQL query is equal to select star from customers where name is equal to, and then what I'll do is I'll go character string. Now I'm going to go ahead and instead of typing in that, I'm going to build it up here. And there's a cool function is that when I click character string and it goes here, if I right click, I can go in here and say, oh, where's my quote? Where is it? Right there. And it
Oh,
finds
now
the
that one's new
number
to me.
for
That's
me.
cool.
And so when it builds a string, it's going to put in that double quote there or that quote. And so then I would say plus this plus character, plus alf key plus, and that way I don't worry about, oh, did I miss did I miss something? So sometimes you'll just miss something. So that essentially will build up the string where it's going to say equal to, and then append a double quote, the text alf key or whatever I want, plus then the double quote, double quote, alf key, double quote. And that now becomes my SQL query. So a couple different ways you can handle it from that standpoint. And I like this one a lot because even though it maybe looks a little more verbose, it's rock solid, meaning I don't have to worry about did I put two double quotes or other kind of scenarios here.
And there's one last one. You can also use a backslash, right, as a escape
I think
character.
so. Yeah, let's try that.
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, the traditional
In fact,
backslash.
that's what they've done up here in this. Oh, yeah.
Well, but the issue that
That's a forward
backslash
slash. Forward slash is
is
nice. All right, where's
is
Sarah when we need her? Sarah, I'm sure you have the answer to this.
this is, by the way, this is backslash. This is going to be interpreted by JavaScript in the
Right. Okay.
JSON.
Mm-hmm.
So this is
Yep.
JSON. So there, I'm not sure if backslash works with alpha, although I notice it does look like it's taking it okay, you know. So
Right. And the
oh
reason
yeah, so we can escape carry. And
you
actually
can
that's kind of
escape
a little
that.
nicer than this. I mean,
Yeah, so
this is better.
that's the one I tend to use. And then of
Yeah.
course what you have to keep in mind is that that character itself needs to be escaped. So if you actually want that
Yeah.
backslash, then you have to put it in twice.
Yep. You gotta go equal
Once to
to
tell it that you're going to use it.
hello.
Yep.
So if I do that, it's going to throw an error. So I have to kind of go in
Excellent.
there and put slash slash. Yeah,
That's interesting. Yeah.
it's kind of confusing. But yeah, this one's actually probably a more traditional way of doing escape characters. So I'd probably work with that.
And the using the character string is, I think, actually pretty easy to read. And you said rock solid. I tend to agree with you. It's
Yeah, because you go, oh, did I get it in the right spot? Did I
yeah,
miss a quote? You know,
exactly.
and
The color
especially if you're
coding
doing
helps
something
too. Yeah.
programmatically where I'm putting in, customer ID,
Yep.
where I'm kind of programmatically putting it together. So I say, oh, I might as well just put my quote here. And that should really be a single quote because if it's SQL query, it's going to be a single quote. But the nice is I love this feature where I just right click on here and here's my shortcuts and I can just click here and go in here and just say, oh, it's got to be a single quote. And now they'll put it in there from there. So kind of handy.
Excellent. But that looks like it for questions. We're a little bit light here. Oh, here's one. Although I don't know if I fully understand it. It says, as a best practice, do you build groups initially or do you build them afterwards? Which groups are you referring to would be my question. If you want to just.
Well, we were talking about security groups. I'm thinking in the expanding menu, you definitely have to build them before because
You do
you
have to
have to
build this first.
guide.
Yep.
Yeah, because you'd have to guide the script up here. Let me go up here and get up there. You have to guide the script here, this fields list, to include that group if we're talking about the expanding menu. And this has to be in your data, either in a view or in the actual database table that you want from there.
Okay, great. Yeah, for the expanding menu, right? Great.
Yeah. And again, I would try to use views because then you're not actually having to go in and alter tables. You're just kind of creating and it gives you flexibility. As next week, I really want them to be A to Z, A to L, M to O. This is if I can spell or not, P to Z. This way, you could essentially change it in the database, and you don't have to touch a line of code because it will just look at that database and say, oh, here are my groups. My unique groups are these three things. Those are going to be my top level menu. And so it does all that hard work for you. And thus your solution is much easier to modify and update. You don't have to worry about going in and editing a bunch of code yourself.
Awesome. Well, Dion, thanks very much. It looks like we've cleared out the questions for today, but if people do have further questions, you can go ahead and send them to guides, GUIDES, at alphasoftware.com. Welcome back, everyone. Thanks for joining us today, and we hope to see you next week at our next Wednesday webinar. Take care and goodbye. Thanks.